Welcome very much to this book launch of our multigraph translations of security. I know this is a very diverse audience, both in the room and virtually as well. And if there are some parts of our presentations that are more challenging than others, then please wait for the next section. We might radically change our tone of voice and what goes on. So be patient with us. In a moment, Trine, as it says over here, will tell you about what's actually in the book that we are launching today, the main argument. And Jonathan will give you one of the tales that are included in the book. We have a huge theoretical argument, and then we actually have people who's done empirical research and telling about it. Karen, who's there, will provide kind of a textbook example of the kind of analysis that this framework for analysis that we're presenting invites. And then in the end, Ole will join us for a discussion with any of you who wants to challenge or discuss with us. Finally, of course, there are snacks and bubbles, and that's the most important part, that we'll actually have not champagne, but something that looks like it on a Tuesday here. But before we get that far, you'll have to bear with me for a moment while I kind of contextualize the book a bit. I don't really know if this is prudent, but my claim is that in a couple of ways this book, and perhaps particularly this launch here, represents a couple of returns, because most of you might be familiar with that there is such a thing as the Copenhagen School of Security Studies, mainly known for the theory of securitization. This idea that security is not just something that's an objective fact, but you have to create politically a security situation in which you can do extraordinary stuff in defense of something really important that you feel is threatened. But you might not know that this Copenhagen School actually began at what was then called the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, which today, in a sense, is part of DIIS, because these there was a couple of institutes that were fused together. Since then, since the end of COPRI, you might say that the main home of the Copenhagen School have been the Department of Political Science at University of Copenhagen, and there we had for some years a central institutionalization called the Center for Advanced Security Theory. It's still there. So the first return that I'm going to claim here is that actually a lot of people who were part of CAST or that Copenhagen School environment at the University of Copenhagen, part of it, or took part in discussion, or just were hanging around, and they're actually now at DIIS. Not just three of the authors here. Ole has to stay at the University of Copenhagen, but the rest of us are here now, and there's actually some more people working at DIIS now who are part of those discussions at the University of Copenhagen. To make that clear, that claim that in the sense the Copenhagen School is partly returning to DIIS, it's also clear that this Copenhagen School is not a school in the sense that you're disciplined to adhere to the party line. It's more perhaps being socialized into a particular way of finding something more important than other, at finding some problematiques more important than others, but also a way of working together, I think, discussing, debating each other's text, but also in this case writing texts together. And that might be the second return that I'm claiming here, that another way of returning is that the volume here, it's not an edited volume, it's an anthology. We actually wrote this as a book together, so it's not a monography, it's not one guy sitting writing. We actually four persons who wrote this together, and that in a sense is also a return to a preferred way of the earlier incarnations of the Copenhagen School of writing texts together. But then this is not just a multigraph. We also got people like Jonathan to actually contribute little tales that we sprinkled across the book. So it's it's a multigraph with tales sprinkled over it. And here, if perhaps don't record this, but I could tell you a little truth here is that when we were about to wrap up the original Copenhagen Center for Advanced Security Theory grant, Ole was away from the center for some time, and the three of us conspired just to kind of wrap the center up with a little nice, easy, edited volume. But then Ole came back and said, no, we should do something more interesting. We should write something together. And then the grant ended. So we actually produced most of the text after we had time and money to do it, and that might be part of the explanation why it took some years to get to get here. Then the final movement, which might not be a return, but it's but partly so, is this is a graph illustrating the point I'm trying to make now from the concluding chapter of the book, and I'll try to use it to talk about the relationship between the book and the theory of securitization, because in one sense this book is about securitization, but then again it's not really. You could say that it's part of a movement of saying, okay, securitization, security in the sense of securitization is still there, it's important, but it's not everything. So it's a way of, this book is a way of provincializing the concept of security involved in the theory of securitization. And the reason we have this graph here as part of the book is that sometimes when you're trying to understand what goes on out there, what is security politics, what's dominating the world in that sense, sometimes it's very fruitful to have a very tight concept, a closely well-defined and narrow idea of what is security. You can actually explain stuff from that idea, but in other phases, other things are happening out there which makes it more convenient, more fruitful to zoom out and have a broader view of how different kinds of security, different kinds of what we in this book call modes of controlling or engaging unwanted futures, how different kinds of concepts and programs intervene with each other and intermingle. So what securitization theory did a couple of decades ago was to say that, well, we've had a long period now where classical security studies thought they knew what security was, but in practice and in theory, a lot of other things were being discussed, other things than military security was being discussed as security. So there was a widening of the concept of security, and then securitization theory was an attempt to see, okay, how can we structure this, study this in a structured way, a well-defined concept of security. Then there's been a debates over the last decades about how this tight concept of security doesn't necessarily explain as much or as it did earlier. Risk has been discussed, and where we are now is that we kind of zoom out and loosen, widen our concept of what counts as security, what mechanisms are relevant to understand security as it is today. And therefore we are focusing, as Trine will tell you in a moment, on a wide field of translations of different kinds of security. And maybe someone else will then tighten, or we will later, before we retire, tighten the conceptual knot again and say, okay, now we can have a new definition of what really should count as security in looking back at the period we are looking at now. Yeah. We hope you'll discuss this and other stuff with us later, both because it's a question of does it make sense to you, does it make sense of the world as you see it, but also because what we aim to do is to present something pretty tight in the sense that there's a lot of the empirical examples we have that others have been studying also, but we're trying to package it in a way that make it possible for others to challenge it, and we think that's a pretty important normative point also, that that you have to make yourself open to criticism by actually stating something that people can agree or disagree with. So maybe that will be the kind of discussion we'll have later, or later today, or some other day. This was my attempt at an introduction. Now Trine will tell you what's the main message of the book, and then we'll get to the empirical analysis that these theories or frameworks open for.
I will try at least.
Please, you have to operate the...
Yeah. It's very loud, isn't it?
No.
No? Oh, maybe it's just, ringing in my ears here. Thank you, Ulrik. So, I'm here to talk about the main argument of the book. As Ulrik said, actually our starting point for writing this book was that something new was happening. That stuff was going on in the world that we didn't quite capture any longer. We needed new analytical tools, basically, for understanding what we in the book ended up calling unwanted futures. We didn't want to use the term security, but we wanted to use a term that was flexible and open enough to say what's going on out there that people are talking about in different ways. These are unwanted futures, things we do not want to materialize in the future. And we developed this book as an analytical framework to capture exactly that. These many forms of unwanted futures floating around, not captured by the concept of securitization or risk for that matter, or unsustainability, but across different kinds of concepts. So, to say it very precisely, our point of departure is that we are witnessing a situation where threats, risks, and security issues, they don't fit the boxes that we have. They don't fit the tools that we have. But not everything is new. We are not stating that nothing can be used from before, quite to the contrary. We live in a time of translations where old concepts and the old ways of organizing security knowledge and governance are in a constant battle, negotiation, translation, with new ways of handling, new ways of governing security, other stuff we don't want to materialize in the future. And that is why, if we take point 2 on this slide, which is actually just a copy of one of the boxes in the first chapter of the book. Point 2, why should we study translations of security? We should study translations of security because it helps us understand the current security landscape. At the same time, we should study translations of security in this way because it enables a critique of current security practices. So it's not just developing a methodology, it's also developing a tool for criticizing what's going on today. Right. As Ulrik said, we found ourselves in need of a new tool, flexible enough to cover it all, but still being transparent about what we were doing, about analytical choices. This has been a red thread, we'd say in Danish, like an overarching ambition is to keep open about the analytical choices, so as to be ready for critique, but also open to it. And here we offer the concept of a translation zone, described here on the first point on the slide, as that concept. That's a point of observation, you might say. It brings to the fore how different conceptual expressions of how to handle threats, risks, unsustainability, the unwanted futures, how they meet and how they are negotiated, translated into new meaning. That's the basic argument of the book. In a translation zone, meaning meets. And I will explain more how we mean what kind of meaning. But this is central. It's a point of observation from where we can see different agencies, concepts, handling an unwanted future in a specific way in a negotiation with others. Karen will give us an example later of how this happened during the COVID-19 crisis. And outside, actually, you will find a brief that is an example of such a translation analysis. Right. So, our basic claim is that in order to understand how society handles some of the most important problems it faces today, we need to pay attention to how different ideas about threats, risk and dangers meet, and what new meanings and future political possibilities are prescribed in the translations that take place in these meetings. But when something meets, there has to be something pre-existing which exists in order to produce a meeting. And here, going through the cases and analysis, we were sitting there wanting to do an edited volume, really, Ole challenging us to say, no, let's write a book. So we looked through. We looked through cases and the tales, one of which Jonathan will provide later. And we just settled on a grid for understanding what was going on. And basically, these are modern categories that have been ordering practices in society for decades, even centuries. They are professions and disciplines, that's one. Cultures, that's the second one. And scales. And by looking at these modes of ordering, we zoom in on what we call translation zones. So in this slide, we look for translation zones where one established mode of ordering, like a discipline or a profession, a culture, be it a national culture or an organizational culture, or a scale, which is a hierarchical organization of the international domain. While they meet each other, one discipline meets another discipline in trying to figure out what to do about COVID. One culture meets another culture. We will look at Sweden, Denmark. And one scale meets another scale, maybe the individual decision in the meeting with a pandemic. We look at that meeting, but we also look at the meeting where that kind of old ordering between these modern forms of ordering, disciplines meet disciplines, it's not always what happens. Sometimes, and we describe this in the book, there's something that challenges the whole organizing principle. And for a discipline, that might be the amateur. The amateur, we argue, has risen to become the holder of authoritative knowledge. This was not so before. Think of the doctor-patient relationship. It used to be a very stable relationship where a discipline or a profession would have the authoritative tools to say what was going on. Today, the patient will ask the University of Google or Wikipedia and will challenge the doctor or will challenge the decision to vaccinate children, for instance. And it will be taken as democratically good, maybe even. It will be taken as reasonable, whereas before that would be taken as complete nonsense. Right. So we have an organizing grid in the book where disciplines and professions, that's chapter 3, is analyzed in relation to the rise of the amateur. We look at the cultures, where cultures of nations and cultures of organizations meet, universalizing objects or projects of establishing something that is not confined to entities. And in the scale system, we found the dominant position of the state to be on the defensive, not just from overarching international organizations or, riots from below, but also by super empowered individuals like Osama bin Laden, that challenges the primacy of the state, the guarantee that the state is the primary actor in security or military affairs, and basically creating networks that will destabilize the old, let's say, silos we used to think security through. So, what's new about that, you might say? These structures will be well known to most people who've studied security. Yeah, okay, so let's talk about cultures, let's talk about disciplines, let's talk about scales. We argue that they are all under attack. That's the floating situation we are in. Everything is under attack. And what we've been trying to do in this book is devise a framework for analysis that can include them all in the same model. So it becomes flexible enough to understand this time of translations that we argue that we are living in, and that has all this floating happening. We're saying, okay, but let's not panic. Let's not throw ourselves into the washing machine on, the high centrifugal program and just say, okay, what will we get out? No, let's stand back and say what was stable before, and how can we then observe things that move? And I said things, which is probably not the best term. I should have said concepts or structures of meaning. How can we see the negotiation over the meaning of central security concepts as an instance of how security works today? That's basically what we do in the book. So, what's the key ambition? What should you guys take away from here? What should everybody take away from this book? It's been very important throughout the work with this book that this should be of use to students. So we are providing a framework that can be used in different settings, different problems that students creatively find in the world, and they will be able to use this framework to basically systematize their thoughts about what's going on. Furthermore, and I think this has been very important also of late, we've wanted to spark a constructive debate in the broader field of the social sciences on analytical strategies and their political investments. What does that mean? It means what Ulrik said and what I just mentioned before: transparency, decency in research, showing where we're going and how, laying it bare so as to have a good conversation and constructive conversation about how science should work in a chaotic time. We also wanted to enable a critique of security practices, broadly understood. Broadly understood, I added, because it's not just the old security. So we have to start thinking about security as something that is constantly being negotiated. Sometimes it's the doctor who tells us what's dangerous. And in a pandemic, that's a security issue, right? The doctor might not have evidence to close a border, but still he might appear as a security practice broadly understood. So it's just to, to get an idea of what types of practices we are including. Jonathan will tell us about a chilling type of practice later about torture. And then finally, and this is the last thing I'll say, we basically really wanted to have a systematic attempt at studying security in chaotic times. There's desperation in security studies for grasping what's going on. I think it's safe to say that there's also desperation in the world to understand what's going on. And we try to offer with this book a systematic take on how to understand what's going on. From climate change to immigration to terrorism, you name it. And now Karen, you will take over with your talk, right? No, it's oh sorry. Jonathan, you go first. I'm sorry.
Try to we're looking around trying to organize this conference for people who are doing really. I'm trying to unmute now. I'm still not. This better? Sorry. We're looking around for people who were doing really detailed empirical stuff about a lot of different kinds of security problematics, and we were very high on our list of targets were Jonathan, and in a moment you'll probably understand why. But the story is that he came to our conference and told you roughly the tale you'll present us with now, and that was one of the most inspiring ones for our thought. And now we even moved from Switzerland to Copenhagen, so we'll have enjoy more conversations with you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's really cool to be here and to see the book out. So thanks so much for organizing and for the nice time in Copenhagen before when this started and now. So as you just heard, I'm basically going to go fully empirical and discuss one of the tales that's in the book, which discusses some of these core concepts from some of the work research I was doing at that time and I'm still doing. And the title. I don't have slides, so don't worry, but it's a nice story. The title of the tale in the book is Hot Tea with Sugar and the Translations of Torture. I think that's still the title. And you'll see why in a second. But I'll just read the story to you, and it should make sense as we flow forward. So the story begins in January 2002, when the United States asked itself in internal documents whether it should continue letting its detainees at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba continue to think they're going to be taken and shot outside, or should instead give them some hot tea with sugar to reassure them. And this question of whether to be benign or to be brutal was resolved with finally a call in the same document to acquire experts in the detainees' culture to help us with issues such as this. And while the names of the experts who eventually arrived are unknown, we do know their nationalities. They were Egyptians, Jordanians, Syrians, Libyans, and other regional neighbors. Security agencies from these states offered their staff to assist US and British and other forces in their interrogation of prisoners at that time. And as is well known then, to summarize, the United States ultimately chose to import a kind of global expertise in brutality. It didn't give people tea and sugar. And the logic underlying this decision resolved around a simple claim that the bad inaction of torture is a bad thing, everybody agreed, was preferable and should be embraced in an attempt to preempt a much worse possible future. In that sense, the ticking time bomb scenario, that terrorists are everywhere, that they're going to blow everything up. Against this, however, critics immediately countered, as you would, that torture itself, if it was enacted now, would produce an even worse possible future, that it would change something intrinsic about those who enacted this practice, about the culture of the United States, about the identity of the Western world, which was a topic of much conversation at that point. What kind of future would emerge if the democratic states of the world were fundamentally engaged in a non-democratic practice of this kind? And so in the tale, I kind of focus on what this idea of changing us means concretely. What does it mean to say we will be changed if we do this? How will we ourselves be translated? And I want to suggest, or I do suggest in the tale, that basically it relates to this intimate, practical, everyday entanglement of different security cultures in the joint inaction of forms of violence, and as the old saying goes, the betrayals intrinsic to acts of translation. And I'll talk specifically about how this movement towards torture translated particular torture practices, hierarchies in world politics, and the ontologies of the actors involved, ontologies or identities, we could say. And to do so, I want to return back to Guantanamo Bay, where we can see the kind of brutality of these translations in the testimony of one prisoner, Mohamedul Slahi, who was one of the so-called high-value detainees held there, and who, when he was released, wrote an autoethnographic kind of account, his memoirs of his time there. And in that memoir, he records, he writes about a conversation between American, Jordanian, and Egyptian torturers as they were torturing him. And I'll just quote from that conversation. "We appreciate everybody who works with us. Thanks, gentlemen," said the US interrogator at Guantanamo Bay. "We're happy about that. Maybe we'll take him to Egypt and he'll say everything," said an Arab guy whose voice I'd never heard with a thick Egyptian accent. "Somebody like this coward, it takes us about 1 hour in Jordan until he spits out everything," said the Jordanian interrogator. And so, while competing perversely here over the relative efficacy of their violence work, these interrogators were simultaneously inflicting a method of torture that Slahi describes as ice cubes and smashing on his body. And this particular torture technique, this particular practice of inflicting pain, was introduced to Guantanamo Bay by those two external security experts and the security culture that they came from, before it was later, in fact, re-articulated in Iraq and elsewhere by US Special Forces personnel in Abu Ghraib and other places. And indeed, the US Department of Defense themselves noted that techniques used in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, and elsewhere had directly migrated from Guantanamo Bay and this space of mixing of different security professionals. And this trade and transfer of torture practices moves me to kind of the first element that I think is translated by this entanglement of different kind of security cultures. The morphologies of particular practices themselves, the actual content of practices, of what we do in the world. Security practices don't simply exist as is, but are rather kind of fused, bonded, and recombined so as to translate practices of action very significantly, in this case, clearly. We also saw this during the Cold War, for example, when a move towards clean forms of torture that don't leave marks on the body was originally developed through a mimicking of Soviet techniques, as well as scientific experiments into the efficacy of these techniques. But then that repertoire of being clean shifted post 9/11 by combining that psychological process with more brutal forms of torture to produce a clean and brutal practice of pain, in which that ice cubes and smashing would inflict extreme pain but not leave marks on the body that could be forensically determined. And so what I want to say is these kind of morphological translations in torture practices were mediated through human bodies like Slahis, and he himself, in fact, describes these experiences of a kind of spatial or geopolitical multiplicity in which the violences of multiple security cultures were enmeshed in the same space, and he calls it an abduction within an abduction. Being abducted by the United States, being abducted then by the Egyptians, being abducted and moved across different spaces of security. And so the violence unleashed at Guantanamo Bay and elsewhere related, I think, to the specific expertise imported into this field of action, and not simply any temporary state of emergency, not simply any exceptional moment. And indeed, once torture became, in the words of the Open Society Foundation, very literally globalized in this way, a practice of multiple different nations coming together and globalizing the way they would inflict suffering, at least two further forms of translation were set in motion, as I mentioned earlier. One of the hierarchies of world politics, and the second of the kind of ontologies or identities of its actors. So, to start with hierarchies, material assistance in this detainee program was not provided in subservient terms. Jordan, Egypt, and other states weren't client states. They could make demands, and they often did. And to show this, we can turn to another detainee who has disappeared within the system, Sami al-Saidi, who was a Libyan dissident living in exile until 2004, when he was arrested in China, transferred to Hong Kong, and then rendered by the CIA and MI6 back to Libya, where he was placed in the custody of the Libyan state, tortured, imprisoned, and sentenced to death, although in the end the sentence was not carried out. Importantly, the CIA and MI6 did not care about this guy at all. He was irrelevant for them. He didn't pose any threat. And he was abducted solely at the whim of the Libyan authorities in return for their intelligence cooperation. Indeed, there are many other instances in which authoritarian states demanded and received assistance of this kind from democratic states in such a way as to invert the traditional view of counter-terrorist cooperation being led by the United States with everybody else following. To move quickly to ontologies and identities, however, it's important to note that upon al-Saidi's release after the and the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Syria, a series of documents were discovered in Libya detailing MI6's involvement in his abduction and torture. So he began legal proceedings against the British government. The British government refused, however, on national security grounds, to try his case openly, and instead instantiated a trial in the secret court system that it established post 9/11. In response, al-Saidi gave up his search for justice with the words that I went through a secret trial once before in Gaddafi's Libya. In many ways, it was as bad as the torture. Secret courts, a post 9/11 adaptation of authoritarian practices, were considered necessary to mask the obvious complicity in torture of the kinds I've just described, echoing quite directly, of course, authoritarian, non-democratic state practices. And that's what I mean then by the translation of ontologies or identities, the enmeshing of different security cultures or practical repertoires together in this space of violence at Guantanamo Bay necessitated eventually changes to the identity of all involved. as well as to the morphologies of torture practices themselves, and that reshuffling of world political hierarchies in some small way. And it's here then that I think the concrete meaning behind the idea that torture changes us becomes very clear, and where we can find the genesis of accelerating changes and an accelerating concern, to go back to what Trine said about the state of the world, about the ways in which it seems increasingly difficult to differentiate certain democratic states from non-democratic states, the blurring of the lines between what's acceptable to do as a state authority. We see it through these processes of translation. Long-term effects build up like this, and suddenly the British government is operating secret courts in which nobody is allowed to intend or talk about what goes on. So, to end back with Slahi in Cuba, he also described the moment in which his body was beaten there as marking a thick line between my past and my future. It was then he describes himself as feeling being broken. But it was also perhaps one forgotten moment in which the choice between being benign and brutal, between torturing people or having the ICRC give them hot tea and sugar, was made very clearly, and a definitive translation of the identity of all those involved occurred. And I'll end there. But thank you very much, and thanks guys for organizing.
Very much. That was one of the tales of translations that inspired us and got us going on this project. Now Karen will
It's really cool.
tell you how good we got at it on the way, in the sense that having thought these thought through how these established repertoires of how to handle unwanted futures, having thought through how to analyze them, we were able to do this analysis Karen will now present you with.
Yes, and it works, and it's very loud in this small room. Yes. Let's just get it on, or it's not. Yeah, you just have to put it on view, I guess. Right? Yeah. So I'm going to tell you a tale about the COVID-19 and the Danish management of the corona situation for the past couple of years. So this is basically, it was an attempt to take a case that we all know and illustrate how can we actually use the framework that we present in the book. So this is going to be kind of a pixie book version of the book. And hopefully it can be used as an inspiration. It's not kind of a solid analysis in the same way as Jonathan is presenting it, but it's kind of an illustration that hopefully can inspire students as they go along and want to use the framework for future studies. Yes. Using the frame, so this is not really, let me. Der skifter den. Okay, jamen det er jo også interessant. Sorry. Yes. And what we, when going into the study of the COVID-19 and the Danish management of the COVID-19, it became evident that the concept of precaution was a very powerful concept, or at least became a very powerful concept for the government in presenting their approach to the lockdown of the Danish society. But also became a battleground on different versions, or different visions of how the future should look and what the future should look like. And that battleground was a good example. Was you can study that using the framework that we are presenting in the book, by looking at the three different translation zones and how precaution has become what do you say? It become an expression of different visions of security. So what we did was to look at how the Danish debate became expressions of different professional logics, and how that become battled across different professions, how cultures become expressed in different ways, and especially looking at Denmark and Sweden, and how individuals was responsibilized and how the ideas of the state was actually confronted in the debates on COVID-19. The centrality of the concept of precaution became evident at the famous press conference on this, that we shut down all unnecessary activity for a period of time. We apply the precautionary principle. Here we see how precaution became the main argument for the government's politics on the COVID-19. Looking at the different translation zones and starting from the perspective of professions and the professional logics in play, one could observe a battle between security logic on one hand and health logics on the other hand. In the days around the press conference on March 11, a battle arose in the Danish newspapers on how we should understand the future threats. The health authorities wanted to hold on to a quite traditional logic of risk, talking about what is the calculable risk to society or to the Danish citizens. While the Danish government talking about a precautionary approach, that we need to do something immediately because of uncertainty, because we do not know what the future will bring. So it became a battle between those different logics, one of health and one of security. The consequences was actually a new law that took the decision-making powers of epidemics away from the National Board of Health, and actually making it clear to everyone that precaution and security was the overarching argument for the lockdown of the Danish society. But while this was going on for around 1 month, in April 2021, the Danish vaccine program gave rise to a new battle on precaution, which was quite the opposite, showing quite the opposite. Here we saw how the health authorities was using precaution as a kind of a way to say we need to hold back to the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine out of precaution. We need to preserve the health of the Danish citizens. So here the positions was reversed, and the Søren Brostrøm, the director of the National Board of Health, argued that we need a precautionary approach towards a vaccine at that time. At the same time, the Prime Minister came out and openly criticized that approach by saying, I simply do not understand that decision. Now I cannot see anything. So, no, but that was, she came out and also criticized it, but at the same time, the leader of the opposition party, Jakob Ellemann, also came out and say, I simply do not understand that decision. And also that was taken up also by the industry by talking about by the chairman of this is going really well, why? Brian Mikkelsen from the Dansk Erhverv, came out and say we need to take the power away from the health authorities in order to keep on going with the vaccine, referring to a kind of quite traditional understanding of risk, talking about that, the risk is so low by taking the vaccine that we need to keep on to a normal calculable risk understanding. So here we saw the kind of the battle again about the concept of precaution. So these two episodes that I'm just talking about here, of course it comes down to a battle of professional logics, but also paved the way for an understanding that when science is not enough, security politics has to kick in. But it was never clear when something was a security politics or not. There was different at some point, the government was talking about security politics, and another point, the health authorities are talking about now we need to have a security politics kicking in. Going to the second translation zone that we also talk about in the book. So now it's not going anywhere. Okay. When we talk about cultures, precaution also came to matter in the way that it came to demarcate the difference between the Danish and the Swedish politics towards COVID-19. Sweden embraced, there was a nice picture of a nuclear plant. Okay. So Sweden embraced a quite clear functional differentiation between the health logics of security and the government's logics of security. In the sense that it was clear, as you probably all know, it was clearly separated, going back to the authority of what is actually the actual health consequences of installing new policies on COVID-19. So there was a gulf between these two states, and what we argue in the paper is that it became very clear that there was no common Nordic approach to the way we should handle corona and the coronavirus. But it was a gulf that also showed that while the Danish society had an all-embracing logic of security, talking about precaution, and the entire society need to take precautionary steps. The Swedish logic always referred to the scientific knowledge of science, and going back to a more strict on the functional differentiation between the health authorities on one hand and the security authorities on the other hand. So it shows it came in the Danish debate. It came to show a strong and decisive Danish government that was actually acting on the entire society with an all-embracing understanding of security. Are we on? No, but we're not. Last, on the matter of scale, there was a nice picture of the Leviathan here. We saw in the Danish debate much debate about responsibility. Who bears the responsibility for the security situation? And here we argue that the individual came to take up a certain place in that debate that we didn't see before in the same way, or not maybe long before, but not in immediate history. They were simply called upon, individual citizens, to take responsibility for our national security in a different way. So it was not only the state who had to take responsibility for security as we normally see it through history or in modern times, but the individual came to take up a central place. One key example of this that confronted that kind of separation between private and public decisions and responsibility happened when the vaccine program for children was launched in June 2021, this year. So even before the vaccine was officially approved, parents was asked to sign their children up for the vaccination. There was no kind of clear evidence, no scientific evidence that it was actually scientifically that we could scientifically defend vaccinating children. But parents was asked to do that, not to save their own children, but to save society. It was a societal argument of national security. And the chairman of the Danish Patriotic Society called upon a precautionary approach towards the possible side effects of the vaccinations. So suddenly the children became the referent object of security, in his approach, where in the government's approach, it was the state and the survival of the Danish society that was actually called upon. It's just... So, what he argued, the director of the Patriotic Society, he said, we also allow ourselves to question whether it's all necessary to vaccinate this part of the population. For the conclusion has emerged based on some theoretical calculations associated with very much of a great uncertainty. So the concept of precaution in that way was engaged as a matter of the lack of science, yet this time it was the children that was the object of protection and not the state as we normally see it in security politics. So here was the quote. Never mind. So what we basically do in this small brief is to say that there are a few key takeaways in all of this. One is that there was in the Danish debate a political and professional battle over the meaning of precaution. We do not want to settle that debate. We're not settling it. We're showing that there are political battles going on how to define it, and it might go in one direction. The government definitely use that to go in one direction. The health authorities also have used it maybe to go in another direction, but there is a battle going on the definition of meaning here and in different translation zones on professional logics, on culture and on scales. And on cultures we say that risk cultures of Denmark and Sweden has differed. It shows to differ and it clashed. I'm not sure that this is so new that it clashes, but at least it became very evident in the debate that there was a clash between the Swedish and the Danish understanding of how to handle the crisis and also how to use the logic of precaution. And last, as the individual was mobilized as the front line of the defense of the state. So this is the main takeaways from this. Thank you. And sorry for the confusion in the beginning.
Of course, the point is of this presentation might be to make you know more about the translations of torture, the translations of corona, but the main point of the whole book is that we are able to devise a framework that can organize these different kinds of cases and translations, and then hopefully we can see larger pictures of these translations. The second last point of the agenda here is that I've invited everybody up here, or we invited ourselves, and then you will please challenge us, and then when you stop doing that, we'll have snacks and.
It was a very leading way of organizing that. Okay, I'm for some reason I'm put in charge of this. So thank you to my three co-authors for doing all the work as usual, and now in presenting the book, and to Jonathan for representing the more than 20 boxed tales in the book. So there are a lot of very different other stories. This was just one highlight. I think the reason that I'm chairing this session is basically that otherwise I wouldn't be doing anything, so it's just for all of us to be here. But Ulrik did also hint that somehow if we got into trouble, I'm ultimately responsible for having started this whole thing by founding the Center of CAST based around this research project 8 years ago. But in any case, I think I'll just say one or maybe two things. One very practical thing. We of course think you should all go away and buy this expensive hardcover book. But if you don't feel like that, it's actually also available for free because it's open access. So go and read it. Then otherwise I'll just open up for questions and answers. You ask the questions and some of these people answer it. And while you're thinking about what to ask, I'll just maybe add one thing that wasn't maybe said so explicitly, and was in some sense the whole starting point for the whole thing. Is that in some sense it's not new that we have many different perspectives on unwanted futures. And going back to the diagram that Ulrik showed in the beginning, we could have a narrow concept of security, but suddenly you realize there's so many people looking at unwanted futures, and they've been doing that all along. Insurance agencies have their way of doing it. Technical engineering expertise have other ways of doing it. Intelligence companies have other ways of doing it. Communities and cultures have different concepts of what is dangerous, and so all that is not new. But the starting point and our kind of basic idea is to say that used to be handled somehow separately, that it was possible for all of these people to do their thing independently. And the new thing is that all of this is happening by people intersecting. We are comparing things. We know we can't just choose one thing and ignore the other thing. So we are constantly comparing incomparable stuff. Is terrorism worse than climate change? How do you do that? You can't ask any experts to compare that, because there's one kind of expert talking about one and another kind of expert talking about the other. So somehow things are happening in between. You're comparing, you're seeing connections, you're struggling over areas. So everything is happening in this in between. And this is in a sense the starting point. How do we handle the fact that illogical things are happening? There's no logical way of translating between these things, and nevertheless it does happen all the time. All these different forms of concepts and knowledges are intersecting in real life. How do we study that? That's what we've tried to create a setup for. But as I said, now the chance is for you to tell us why we're wrong, give us other ideas, tell us what the next book should be about, or ask questions if you feel like it. Vibeke?
I'll just go with the mic one moment.
Right. Vibeke at the very back.
This was supposed to be a question for the very end of the session, because I am actually going to ask you what the next book is supposed to be about. Or at least I wanted to ask you to reflect on. I was unable to be here for the very beginning of this event, so I don't know how much has been said about how this project grows out of the original Copenhagen School Security as a Speech Act framework of analysis, roots of Ole's career and everyone sitting here. I don't know if that was mentioned at all, but okay, it was mentioned. Great, because what I wanted to ask you was if you could reflect on the extent to which the perspective here and the kind of framework for analysis that you present here, to what extent has the original framework been adapted, extended, transformed because of further reflection on your part, and to what extent does it reflect the fact that the world has changed and that it's simply a different context that the struggle over security takes place within today? I know enough of the book already to know that you'll lean towards the conclusion that the world has changed. But then I wanted to ask you, can you already see now, in a sense, signs of transformations where this perspective wouldn't be enough or would have to change in a different, like, for how long do you expect for this framework of analysis to be relevant, or how soon would it need some adaptation, and do you see where it would need some further reflection? How long will we remain in the risk culture, or the security culture that we're in now, knowing that you speak of risk and security cultures in the plural in the book as well? Yeah, that's the question.
No, that's a very good question. I mean, Ulrik presented this slide in the beginning, and this is part of the whole argument that in a sense, in the 80s, there was a sense that all kind of other new issues came up and competed to also be security issues, and therefore it made sense to look from securitization and say what is happening when new issues get securitized. What happens if we treat migration as a security issue, health as a security issue, and so on. But that was a kind of one-way traffic, as if all these areas were empty, and then came security suddenly and gave a way of looking at it. But that was increasingly obvious, that in a sense what I was trying to say now by this, that there are all these different knowledge. All these other areas had their own forms of knowledge. So it's a bit imperialistic to assume they had no way of thinking until we came with a securitization to it. So instead it's actually an interaction between these different forms. And therefore there was at first a discussion that kind of was the risk security, and that was a bit too simplistic, as if now we're changing from security to risk or something like that. And that's why we try to capture it by this, and as I was also hinting here, that and as you were implying in the question, that is a sign of a time where this is the way things are fighting out. I think also, maybe especially Karen's tales show this is what is going on. So it is a way of trying to find a mode of speaking to our current situation. And now I have to move far away from the others because I think we disagree here. I mean, I think I always have an idea for what kind of theory I would like to propose, and they don't agree, I think. And I would still think in a kind of securitization-like manner of that there are still quite distinct forms that are going on also in these new areas, and we just need to develop better tools for understanding how riskification, uncertainty making, and so on work. So I actually do think we can make stronger theories, not necessarily because the world is changing in that direction, but because we just haven't worked out the tools well enough at the moment. I think some of my co-authors would disagree with that, so I'll have to write that book and try to show that it can be done.
I think you're right that we disagree on that one. I think that much of the work that Trine has also been doing and I have been doing is to show that security is constantly translated, and to give my own example is how companies are constantly taking upon the task to manage national security issues, or what we know as national security issues, and but that is a constantly development, and I don't think that we can actually talk about a certain way of doing it that would be valid for many years, because I think that's the nice part about securitization is that we are able to tell a simple story about what security is, but the problem is I think at the moment there are so many different developments going on all the time, and it's difficult to capture that in time. And I would think that it would be nice if we could do it, but I don't think it's possible. So it's a nice vision, but maybe it's not so realistic.
And maybe there's also complementarity between those two perspectives in terms of has very much to do. One thing we were very interested in doing this is what is the best way to enable political critique to make visible these things. And in that sense, they are probably complementary in the sense that the translation thing shows these kind of movements and struggles and so on. The advantage of the kind of act focused of showing this is a particular for a risk act and for an uncertainty act is that they entail different kinds of politics, and therefore makes us aware of specific logics that are being used. So just as securitization show, okay, beware, someone is trying to sell you an argument that in order to save you, you have to give up those rights, and then we can do this and that. A risk logic tells you basically there's a certain expertise that you have to bend to. An uncertainty logic tells you, well, there's no way to know, but do something, and then we'll see later if you were doing something bad, and so on. So they bring out different kinds of critical edges. So in that sense, we might be complementary. Trine?
I just wanted to say that since this project has been such a long journey, all of us have also developed other projects along the way. And what I'm working on at the moment is a process of technification, which is also, I think, complementary to what this book is actually trying to do. So technification is basically the process where the politics is morphed in a certain way, where security authority is being deferred to expert communities, to technical language. I've been looking at the Nord Stream 2 project, for instance, and some of my colleagues are looking at nuclear energy in Poland and liquefied natural gas in Lithuania. And we're looking at how security authority is somehow being translated into a technical domain that has no chance of being debated democratically. So, and this, I think much of the inspiration for this work comes from Ole's initial work on securitization, obviously, but also from the conversations we've had in developing this framework, which is really an open but very useful framework for understanding all of the different processes at play. And I have then chosen to zoom in on this very specific form of technification that happens also in the climate change negotiations. I mean, the 26, you will see next week, is going to be all about technification, how we will solve problems through technological gadgets. And you won't be able to, as an ordinary person, actually, to say, no, I think that's a really bad idea, because you might not know much about fusion, nuclear energy, or I don't know, carbon capture and storage. So this technification is a process that's also captured by this framework, but you need to have these deep dives, I think, and that's what we do. I mean, individually and together as well. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Next question. Yeah.
Not that big. I could really do it without a mic, but
No, but
since it's here, I'll use it. My name's John Foley, and I'm probably one of the amateurs that Trine mentioned in the beginning. I've always challenged politicians, science, and authorities as such. And even though my age, I still keep on being a bit critical to what's being said and what's being done. But I have, in the beginning, just a comment about the Swedish-Danish clash. It's always been there, especially in football, you know, and even on history and wars and so on. But I think the difference is more or less in the culture, in the organization of the politicians. Sweden being very decentralized and Denmark being very centralized after maybe the French model or something like that. And maybe the politicians are using these crises for more or less their own ends. That's just a comment. And the other thing is really concerning security as a whole. We have seen that the military and the national security has formally been taken on with our authorities, defense and so on. But I think in the last 10 or 15 years, we have seen the decimation of who does what, and especially in the form where I'm working is with critical infrastructure and critical information infrastructure, where we are seeing each and every sector having responsibility on what to do and how to defend it, and even knowledge enough to do something about it. So here we have the state that really doesn't have enough authority or knowledge or competence within these areas, and 90% of our critical infrastructure is owned by the private. And then also we have the tech companies, giant tech companies, and so on and so forth. So what's difficult for me is to be now very exact and give you a question. But if you could probably elaborate a little bit on this, because I'm not that good at it. Thank you.
That's a Karen question, isn't it?
Yes.
Infrastructure and all that.
Yeah, I think you're very right that there is. I think the kind of responsibilization that I talked about in presenting the COVID-19, you see at a very different scale when you talk about cybersecurity and ICT management. And I think you're absolutely right that there is a translation constantly going on the part of the private sector on how to understand those national security issues, how to, you can say, as in terms of what Ole was saying, how to turn it into the language of risk management. And that is constantly also a translation that is going on in the private sector and with the sector responsibility in the Danish way of doing security and safety. So you're absolutely right that there is a kind of a translation going on there that we need to be aware of, and we also need to study that in terms of understanding the democratic impact of now we have this a giant private sector, 80-90% of that being owned by the private companies, having to deal with our security, having to do the protection of all of us. How can we ensure a kind of democratic management of that, given that they have to translate it into risk thinking.
Thank you. I have a question regarding I think it's called zones of translations, with the translations across professions and levels. Do you think that these are exhaustive, or do you think that there is a potential for further elaboration on the theory in that regard?
Ulrik, yeah.
They're probably not exhaustive, but there is a certain logic to those we picked, in the sense that the professions and disciplines, they're kind of a functional differentiation, in the sense that there is a lot of stuff going on in society, and we parcel it out to different kinds of expertise, right? So that doctors take care of people who are ill, and engineers take care of building bridges, and officers take care of defending this everything, right? So that's one kind of logic, right? That we parcel out responsibility for different issues. Then there's the cultures. That's a different kind of differentiation, saying that okay, we actually have different units taking care of the same thing, but they do it in different ways. We have companies with different organizational cultures that compete over how to do stuff in the most efficient way, but doing the same stuff basically. In the same way, we have nation states with different cultures trying to protect their the citizens and compete in different ways for the best way of being a state taking care of everything, right? And then there's the third kind of differentiation, which is that creating a hierarchy, right? That you can encompass some of the lesser scales in the higher ones. So there might be more kinds of functional differentiation, other stuff than disciplines and professions, etc. There might be other kinds of cultural differentiation, right? Than nations and kind of organization cultures, and there might be maybe not more scales than we listed, but in principle, these three principles of cutting society into pieces, we thought a lot about it, that they represent different ways of cutting society in pieces, and therefore probably different kinds of translations, so different meanings of meaning.
So it does, in some sense, reflect kind of classical macro-historical and macro-sociological categories for the kind of basic organizing principles and a kind of conception of modernity and how it's constituted, and especially Niklas Luhmann is lurking somewhere in the background and so on. So it's not completely arbitrary. So maybe not completely. And on our most optimistic days, we think that this is actually a structure one could use in completely different things from translations of security. It might actually be useful to take this kind of 3x2 thing and use on other things as well. So actually we're quite happy about it. I think the time is saying soon reception, but Charlotte, did you have one last question? Yeah.
Yes, I had a question for you guys about translations and why translations now. And I guess as you were explaining the project, I was trying to understand whether you are, as conceptual historians, so to speak, translating security, the concept of security, into new modes of knowledge, right? New places where they might be happening, like in precautionary principle, which is an environmental thing, for example. So are you translating security, opening up security so that the concept itself, it becomes attentive to what's happening in these other spaces and forms of knowledge? Or is it these other spaces that are translating themselves back into security? In other words, is it driven by sort of the concept or the practices, this business of translation? And also why now, right? Has there not been moments of translation before, when Trine in particular was making the point that there's an urgency now? So what calls for translation now? Yeah.
That's a good one to end on. That kind of frames the whole project. I think.
I'll say something and then you probably correct me.
No. Go.
I think the point here was actually the thing we've been discussing, been having the hardest time to find out what should be the title of this thing be, because in a sense the title translations of security signals that we are talking about security, all of it, but and we had one reviewer early at the United States trying to say that we should call it something about worries. We discussed bad futures for a long time, and now we ended up with unwanted futures. But the whole thing is to provincialize the traditional concept of security. That's only one way of dealing with bad futures or unwanted futures. And then we have risk as another one, different kinds of risk, perhaps precaution as a third one, sustainability talk as another way of trying to manage these unwanted futures. And in principle, they are a par on the same level, and they can meet and be translated into specific practices. But it's difficult because we come out of security studies, so we end up talking of putting this label security on all of it, and that, in a sense, is not very pedagogical.
No, but I mean, as I think both Trine and Karen also said, there is a kind of historicity to this, that we are very much aware that this book is not something that could have been written 30 years ago. It was not a mistake we didn't say this at 30 years ago. So we do think that it is actually capturing, and that it's also it's a reaction to a society where certain parceling out of different forms of knowledges are de facto becoming impossible. That there's no way you can do your insurance work or your intelligence work or your foreign policy or whatever separately in the way we at least practiced it up to a certain point. So in that sense, it's not an interdisciplinarity that we bring to the subject and say, oh, wouldn't it be great if we would start talking more to people from other fields? We're saying this is actually what is happening, and the practices have changed, and we have to develop a framework that is actually able to speak to that. And we are offering that as a kind of macro sociological analysis that we hope would speak to a kind of general audience as well, the same way that Risk Society was speaking to a general audience and so on. But we're also aware that our first and most likely audience, partly because of who we are, will be people in security studies, but we would love people coming from risk studies and some of the other areas to see that, in a sense, the connection works both ways, because we think it does, actually. That was it, right? Or you?
Yeah. No, it was just, I think I very much agree. We very much agree with what Ulrik was saying about the practices. And I also think that, it's always difficult, at least for the broader audience, to say, when did we start to think about that in new ways? But I think that if we go back to 9/11 and talking about climate change, talking about organized crimes, talking about pandemics, and it all made us aware of a new kind of reality that we need to face and we need to study in new ways. We're not saying that it started with 9/11, but what I'm saying is basically that at least make the practices that we used to hang on to impossible, and made us aware that we need also new ways of understanding those practices, because otherwise we cannot be critical and we cannot see what it is that we need to turn our attention to in terms of academia.
Okay, thank you all for listening to us. Thank you to DIIS for hosting us. And thank you even more to DIIS for what is happening now, right?
Yeah. Whoa.